Ashwani, it has been a delight to have you in Cairo at AUC for the last 8 days. We have abused of your kindness, of your generosity, so many interventions, so many talks, interviews, contributions to the workshop, the first workshop that we had, on different topics, different subjects. But let me start with the first activity to which you contributed, which is the workshop on the new international economic order. We had participants from Latin America, from Asia, from Europe, from the United States. So tell me, was it a good idea to have a workshop to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order and to look forward what a new order could be? Was it appropriate in the context of a project the focus of which is to look beyond neoliberalism, to get out of neoliberalism, what the solutions are to the problems that arose because of neoliberalism? Was this an appropriate idea?
Well, Ibrahim, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here with you, your group, project group with the university. And it has been a wonderful experience. Yes, indeed, there have been many topics. And I should say it was 10 days, not 8 days. So all better for me. I think it has been a very interesting and intellectually exciting experience. So thank you for that. The question you raise about the project and the new international economic order, that idea, I think it was very appropriate. My experience of the conference was very positive. On the whole, you know how conferences are. They have to cover a large span, but I thought it was a very positive and successful conference. But your question is about whether it was, in a sense, appropriate and
relevant to what we do.
And I think that was, to my mind, very much so. It struck me that you had combined the 50th anniversary idea coming from 1974 to now, and that timing aspect, you picked on that very cannily, and I thought it was it was timely. It was the conjuncture is very sound. It was forward-looking. You said, 50th commemoration, but had it been just a commemoration conference, I think your own answer might have been different. What is the point? But you used that as a springboard for looking ahead. And the time at this stage, the conjuncture now for looking ahead is very appropriate. So yes, I think the conference was very timely and appropriate and forward-looking.
What was discussed in the first day of the conference? What was discussed that is relevant for our purposes to go beyond neoliberalism? On the second day, there was discussion about what the issues are in the third decade of the 21st century, what new subjects have emerged, what new challenges have appeared before the global community, let's say. So what do you think? Did the conference show the way towards discussions of what a new international economic order could be, and what this order could include as analysis, as perspectives, as programs of action to go beyond the neoliberal policy framework in which global North and global South have been constrained in the last 50 years?
Well, it's a very big ask. I think the research program and the conference coming out of it are ambitious. And I think without having that ambition, you would not be able to ask the big questions. So I think it's very right that the first day of the conference asked the big questions, and the second day tried to focus more specifically on aspects of those, ways forward, and the specifics. That was a good structure. And in the first day, which was on the history and historiography of the conference, didn't really focus only on the history. I found it very interesting that the frame which was used for discussing the origins of the original new international economic order, that those were framed in a manner about how it happened, what the constraints were, what were the forces behind it, the motivations behind it, the constraints in it, the partnerships in it, and how it went. Similar questions are appropriate now. And in a sense, the two moments, you never step into the same river twice. So since 1974, much water has flowed down the Nile. But strangely, the conjuncture has some similarities. At that time in 1974, people were saying, well, it seems as if the old aspirations of development from the developing economies had started floundering a little bit, especially on the international dimensions. And there was a need for a new international order. That led, paradoxically, with the 1973 oil price hikes, which had a very powerful effect at that time and continue to do so. It led to a situation which almost made the new international economic order in 1974 both necessary and much more difficult. The challenges were much greater. And that's what also, I said paradoxically, introduced the role of the Bretton Woods institutions in coming in with their programs, so that the development story and the model and the paradigm became one of globalization and then led to neoliberalization, yes, and so on. And so at this time, you have again a moment where that process of neoliberalization and globalization has had the downside of it has become fairly apparent in many, many countries, both also in the North. And so the timing is again, like earlier, a sense of dissatisfaction amongst a lot of the global South, and say, how do we do it? So that way I found there was resonance between the 1974 as history to now, where again the same question becomes very pertinent. And I think that was the way I understood the opening day.
We are in agreement. The question, though, is that you refer to the 1973, the fall of 1973, and following the October War, the rising oil prices, and which to me crowned or allowed the crowning of a process that started earlier in the 1950s. It was crowned with the with the two resolutions of the UN General Assembly in May 1974 of the new international economic order. So the fall 1973 allowed the crowning of a long process. Now, we know the ills created by neoliberalism. Some would not be in agreement with you and me. Some would say that neoliberalism, what is neoliberalism, or why is it responsible? In fact, these are the policies of countries of the global south or even of the global north that have resulted in these ills. Let this perspective aside for a moment. But what are the issues now? What are the issues in the light of the discussions that we had, and in the light of your analysis? What should we research? What should we shed light on in particular? For instance, in our project. in our project in Egypt here, which covers the entire Middle East and North Africa region, the Arab region. What do you think? I will have a follow-up question later, but what do you think this project should focus on? You have seen our research agenda. So what do you think in the light of your analysis and of the discussions, the conclusions that we came up with at the conference last week?
I think my mind travels to some points of difference between the situation of 1974 and now. And that point of difference, I think, is something to which I want to use that as an answer to your very wide-ranging question. In that earlier period, you will recall that the NIEO was driven by, and it had the strong support of a group of recently decolonized countries. There was a solidaristic alliance which was there from decades before that, and that had created the framework for the Global South to come together and say, no, this is not working. The international global side is not working for us. It has to be reorganized in these ways. I think that was a shared perspective. I entirely agree with you that the 1973 events, and you mentioned 1974 as being the crowning point, but before that, I think I mentioned 1973 as a point of inflection for the region and for the Global South. But even that point of inflection, and I was linking it to the question of the oil prices having shot through the roof, but that didn't come out of nowhere. That had a history as well. Like you said, the history goes back to the 1950s. The history of oil goes back much more.
Even earlier.
Much more. And we know that the reaction which was there behind the oil price hikes had the same motivations and spirit that was also part of the movement of the Global South in relation to neocolonialisms and the old colonialism, the old imperialisms and so on, that our products and our natural resources are being undervalued. This happened to be natural products, and you're being left out of the benefits of that. And so that's, I think, if I put it in that very blunt way, the formation of OPEC. So I think that political movement is there before that. So one shouldn't think, 1973, something happened which was terrible. It was a reflection of that aspiration of the Global South, which others also wanted. It happened around oil, which had the effect of dividing the third world into oil exporters and oil importers. And the oil importers had a bad time. And the oil exporters, we know there was a new kind of a financial framework of benefits which then got recycled, and there was a new model which came up. Now that's to now come to the question which you asked about what's different and what's appropriate now.
Yeah, what are the issues? Issues really?
So I think one of the issues which strikes me from here, and that's what it comes up from this idea of division, that old idea of we are all in one boat may not actually be as credible to many other third world economies which are oil importers, and which have also had the very sharp end of the Bretton Woods-led globalization program, structural adjustment programs, the neoliberal programs, which have narrowed down the possibility of any national economic policy, and which have also imposed some kind of a model of governance and of what is a good economic policy for a country, which has taken away many possibilities from their hands. So now when I see it, those countries, there's a certain amount of disempowerment, economic disempowerment in handling your own affairs. And this is a big point of difference. And I think your project, if I read it right, is focusing on this here and now in these aspects. This would be a very major thing to study how in this new environment, also of globalization, production structures are different, economic alliances are different. The third world itself is much more diverse and divided. It's not just uniform old idea that, we export raw materials and we all do the same thing. No, we don't. So you have a much more diverse global south. And in that global south, how to actually, but at the same time, neoliberalization has had a very major impact on a lot of these countries. Maybe there are some exceptions. How do you reconstruct that idea and convert it into something practical in this new environment? Now, I'm not aware that this big ambitious project, that's what I said, it's ambitious, that this ambitious frame of reference has been put on the table by any other research program. So that's what I find attractive and innovative about this research program, that it is raising this question, putting it on the table, and you can't go in with the answers to these questions. So in other words, I don't have the direct answers to say, this is this, and this. If that was the case, it would not be worth it.
Yeah.
But you've raised the right questions, and I think it's very positive. It's a positive move for that reason.
Let me ask you, in fact, your answer leads me to two questions I had in mind. First question is, you're an economist and a very strong economist. What alternative economic policies could there be for the Global South to adopt that are different than those advocated by neoliberalism, to the recipe of structure adjustment, even if structure adjustment to the human face, the different versions of the same recipe. What alternative economic policies could there be in the framework of the global economy and of the powers that be in the global economy? As an economist, what would you say? Fiscal policy, for instance, monetary policy, what would you say? Trade policy, what would you say?
Well, thank you, Ibrahim, for that very small question. I think, again, the diversity of economic situations in different countries, and they would mean that perhaps different kinds of policies would be possible and appropriate in different places. So a uniform, an answer that, Bretton Woods institutions had a uniform kit model, they came with their kit box approach to structural adjustment. Everywhere it was stabilization, this, and this. And then, of course, fiscal discipline, narrow bands there, and so all that. So they had a model which was applied, one size fits all type of approach. And I don't think that approach works in reverse, where you say, what can we do? There is no uniform answer which would come across these different countries. And so China would have a very different answer. And you will recall that in earlier financial crises, although the World Bank and so on was saying, and the IMF was saying that you should have contraction and so on, and China went on its own and had an expansionary policy and broke all the rules in terms of deficit and so on.
And
Malaysia as well. Malaysia had capital controls. The Indian Central Bank, Reserve Bank of India also had a similar approach. They monitored and they controlled and so the impact was contained. Now that shows one policy which comes up, and I think that applies to across the board, that the role of the financial sector globally, and which comes more or less, the impulses come from the north, their ability to destabilize the financial sectors, and therefore the real economies also in the south, in some ways need to be contained. That's one. The other is that there is also domestic capital in third world economies. And the idea is to see, like in the old framework, the idea was domestic capital would invest domestically, but that is no longer the case. I think you were mentioning the other day about the relationship between capital inflows and outflows from developing economies.
Yes.
So there's a huge amount of outflow which goes out from these. And that's part of the parity in terms of capital flows from both ways. But actually the third world economies are not gaining much in that way. Developing economies, or global south. So I think one of the policies which comes up to my mind, and that's related also to the monetary side, the financial side, and also the fiscal side, is having greater control at national level. But national doesn't mean that everybody's doing something completely different. But there has to be an alternative approach to how to have some filters with relation to these financializations. Otherwise, they will not allow a longer-term process of accumulation to take place in developing economies in this. So I think some rechannelization, some new grammar of behavior for domestic capital as well as for foreign capital is called for. That's one thing I'd say. The second thing I think that has happened is that the neoliberalization has massively empowered economic players in the global south within countries which are stronger, which are more powerful, which might be specific industries, might be specific manufacturing industries, might be services of certain kinds, might be labor of certain kinds. It has done that, but it has left out some other sectors which don't have that capacity. So if I think, for instance, of India, and some other countries also, agriculture is not on the same level as services. So I think some of those sectors have been left behind, but in the new framework of policy making, you need some national policy space and a reorientation to say, no, we must redirect investment there. And if foreign investment is not coming into those things, and the corporate investment going into agriculture is only very narrow and focused on commercialization of few crops and here and there, you need the state to perform some role in making sure that agriculture gets a due investment and development in this way. Similarly, you could argue that social sectors have been privatized increasingly. You remember one of the earliest things that happened under the structural adjustment programs was that there were introduction of user costs, even for water.
Yes.
For education privatized, health is privatized. And as it gets privatized and corporatized, there are also exclusions. And then you have the Hirschman effect of the elite and the middle classes who can buy into the new privatization. Then they like it, quality is higher, access is better for them. They opt out, and that allows the public sector even more to be atrophy. And the public sector then is atrophying, but it actually has to cater to the larger part of the population. So again, this model which is there has these weaknesses, and these are shared weaknesses. This last round I'm talking about is actually shared across the board, more or less. So I think that the new framework you asked, what are the new types of policies? I'm just mentioning one or two,
Yes.
which could form the basis of a platform, saying, oh, we must do these things very differently.
So this leads me to the other question I had, but now there is a new question that emerged in my mind. You said that what you just described as problems of provision of social services, these problems are shared. I understand are shared in the global south. So my first question is, speaking of global south, there is questioning of the concept of global south. Like there was questioning of the concept of third world. Global south, subordinate in the global economy. But what else brings the global south together? And what justifies that the global south works together? In our project, we have counterparts, our colleagues from India, South Africa, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. So what would you say that is shared by these countries that justifies and should drive them to work together without, of course, forgetting other countries at different levels of development in the global south, as you have you said very rightly. So I'll have another question, but I'd like to know what you think of.
I think that's a very pertinent observation, Ibrahim, and it tends to moderate, and I wouldn't say puncture, but it tends to moderate one's optimism or idealism or expectations of what can be achieved. In this sense also, it is different from the earlier round, where there was much more optimism and idealism and a sense of solidarity and an idea that it could be achieved. At this time, it is much more realistic, much more pragmatic. The global south as a hold-all term, as a portmanteau in a way, is, as you indicate, from your question, is not problem-free. The internal diversity is very great. So, as an economist, I would say, well, there are differences within the group, and there are differences between the groups. And I would say, for my first observation would be the difference between the groups still dominate. So the old idea of North and South is not disappeared. And this shows up, for instance, in the debates over climate change and the consequences and what to do about it, mitigations. Whereas even the countries which are supposed to be doing very well, whether it is China, whether it is India, in the global south, complain very much that although they would try to do more for the climate change, but they are not being helped. And the problem is much more really a problem of the North, of the making of the North, and also in terms of incremental consumptions also of the North. You can complain about China or India, but if you want to relocate your manufacturing in the global south, then you're also relocating emissions into the global south. You can't have it both ways. You give it there, complain about it, but take the consumption. So I think those divisions, although there's between the two groups, I'm saying two groups, but of course it's a gradation, are still there. Having said that, your question is very sharp. Within the global south, I think the divergences have widened a lot. Even India and China, that the countries I mentioned, if you go back to the 1950s, they were very similar in structure and levels of performance. If you see them now, they're very unequal. Of course, there are structural differences. But even so, their levels are very different. And that's between the two leaders in terms of economic growth and size. If you see other countries, including parts of Africa, you find that the differences are widened much more in this regard. So a common idea of a global south, which is all pulling together, indeed, as you suggest, is not going to be straightforward. But you have to rely partly on the differences between the two groups to override the differences within the group of this global south. Now, how that is achieved, I take the inspiration from the discussion at your conference and your project, and I've read the project documents as well, is partly for looking for new ways in which alliances or axes of cooperation, of maybe finding stakeholders around, not across in a holistic way around everything, which can happen in the General Assembly and those sorts of things, and looking for a new statement, but in terms of specifics, where these groups of countries come together around specific platforms, and that creates an alternative. If you put them all together, they are going with many legs in a similar direction, but with an aspect of cooperation between themselves, so that the rules of the game between the South, global South itself, should not be the same. Some country of the global South should not be able to say, oh, you are behaving like moneylenders from Washington. So I think the pattern of behavior relationally within the global South, in economic terms and political terms, also has to reflect that idea. So it's not easily done, but I think that's the area which I said you put on the table in the conference to look for these sorts of commonalities.
Commonalities between groups of countries in the global South. But what brings together the Global South?
Well, I think a realization that the model of that we've had, this neoliberal era, which did not emerge from the Global South, which was a continuation of the kinds of policies which emerged from the 1970s and 80s, coming out from Washington mostly, that whole model has maybe delivered for certain groups and certain industries, certain stakeholders, in particular countries in the Global South. But if you see the benefits for the country as a whole, for society as a whole, its downsides and its problems are far greater.
In the Global South.
In the Global South. And I think that is what brings, even countries which are successful, within the framework, within the parameters of policy, which neoliberal macroeconomic policy, national, there isn't such a thing as national economic policy or national industrial policy anymore in this way, or national employment policy is also not meant to be there. But if you take within a global framework the role of economic policy as formulated by governments in the Global South, they are unable to handle and they are unable to address, whether willingly or whether unwillingly, the kinds of problems which have been unleashed by this whole era. That realization is now widely shared by the populations. And even regardless of the polity of different polities in the Global South, whether it is a formally democratic country or formally not a democratic country, the leaders are very sensitive to this groundswell of unhappiness about well-being of large sections of the population. At the same time, in the Global South, inequality has increased a lot inside, not just between, but also intra, within the Global South countries. And put these things together, the general acceptance is that it has not been a successful model, the experience of neoliberalism. So something has to be done. And yet you find national policy space is narrow. Groups which have actually got empowered by the process of neoliberal growth in the Global South countries, in many of them, whether it's leaderships or whether it is corporate sectors or there's particular kinds of economic sectors, they have a hold, they have a stake which comes up organizationally and over time. So it becomes more difficult to change that. So so I think the Global South has that commonality of having an experience and a realization that it's not been a successful model for the majority.
So can we say that the failures of the neoliberal model are felt more intensely in countries of the Global South, and this more intense feeling and rejection of the neoliberal model is one factor that brings together countries of the Global South? Can we say this?
I would say yes. On the whole, broadly speaking, everything has qualifications, but I would say yes. But having said that, I would also like to register that it's not a North-South issue alone, like one of the things which came up. I think perhaps it was you who brought this up.
Yes, and this was my next question,
yes.
and my last question.
The South and the North and the South, these are not things to forget. And that also detaches the idea of some formation which is inherently North in nature. And so everybody in it is, oh, you're from the North and you're from the South. On the South, we've said that there are many interest groups and also successful groups which have also powered growth processes. But in the North, I take the example of the UK, US, take France, and look at the state of the excluded youth. At this point in time, if you look at the situation of youth and ask the question, what are the rates of unemployment? Now, unemployment is a difficult concept in the Global South. But if you say unemployment, both in Egypt, in China there is a new term, laid back youth, lying back youth. And the idea is that they've opted out from this race. They can't keep up with it. And that's, in Egypt, there was whole work on the waiting generation. If you see UK, you have the gig economy, you have students who are relying on parents to survive. There's a large section underneath. You go to university, but you come out with a big debt. But when will you be able to pay it back through employment? I think these are questions which actually unite. And the classic case was the case of Brexit from the UK, where the poorer sections of the northeast, the workers, working classes and so on, towns which had been excluded, actually wanted the Brexit, because they believed that globalization had actually been against them. Whereas in reality, they were getting money from the EU precisely for those things, but the government in power had not managed to take that money and translate it into national programs which would help these people. And so I think in that way, there are a lot of similarities between the South and the North and the position.
Absolutely. You know, if you take the Mediterranean and you take youth unemployment in North Africa and in South Europe, in Italy, in Spain, in Tunisia, in Egypt, you will find very, very similar, very comparable rates of unemployment, which makes me again ask a question which you have already answered. I myself take Global South, Global North analytically, but I like to see the global system as one. As we said several times, there is a Global South in the North, and there is Global North in the South. You talked about inequality. Inequality also has widened in countries of the global North, and you know very well economies of the global North. So it's going beyond neoliberalism. A demand of the global South alone, that is justified in the global South alone, or is in fact going beyond neoliberalism in the very interests of populations in the global North and in the global South together, and of the sustenance of the larger political economies of both the global South and the global North, and of peaceful relations and democracies in both regions, which we have referred to analytically rather than as two regions clearly separate one from another.
Well, I think it asks us to look in the direction of a new imagination which incorporates both sides. And that also is a difficult task. Part of the reason is that, for instance, when you have relocation of, say, manufacturing industry or services to the global South, you also effectively are having some sort of a relocation of employment in the global South, towards the global South. The commodity chains, commodities, it could be goods and services, are still controlled in this way. The demand side is from the North. And so while employment might be going the other way, it doesn't mean that the value addition in those services is necessarily all of a sudden biased in favor of the South. So if this becomes a way in which profitability of those enterprises has increased by relocating to the other side, at the same time, the wage share has gone down because the employment has gone disproportionately to the other side, then you're seeing that this would have some sort of an effect on inequality within the North in that way. And I think that is manifest in the US, in the UK, but US as well, very much so. And it lends itself to saying, oh, The Chinese are taking your jobs in manufacturing, the Indians are taking your jobs in services, and that creates the narrative of
for the populists and for the populist movements.
For the populist movements. And that makes it more difficult than to say, oh, we are together, because we are both at the other end of the neoliberal model, which is excluding you, and you might be getting something to the south, but in the south as well, the profit share in those services, they're very highly organized. It's not just the poor person or the poor youth on the street who's sitting there doing on her own this work. They go in call center buses, and they work at night, and then the times are different in their own different languages. There are all sorts of schools to learn odd language and so on, do this. They don't get paid very much. They have no job security. It's a difficult job, but it's very profitable for the people who organize that whole thing. So there's, on both sides, there is a lot of inequality. But you can set up a narrative where you say that, oh, you are doing this to us. I think that's where the difficulty lies to some extent. But I think so. A new imagination is required here. The new international economic order earlier on, and these earlier political organizations which came up even before that in the global south, they had a long history of historical imaginations which converted into political partnerships. At this point in time, we have the shared experience of neoliberalism, but it's not a short period of time, it's 40 years, we're going into the 5th decade. And so there again we have an experience which has to be translated into this shared imagination which overrides these differences, which are created differences, they are constructed differences. And it's a manufactured discontent, which I think we have to in some ways overcome in this regard. Governments may or may not be our best partners everywhere. So this project that you have you're locating it in a space where persuasion is very important. And the first step of persuasion is to have a logical, a rational argument, which is, I think, what your project and is trying to construct.
Yes, the project brings together universities of the Global South, but a larger project also encompasses universities of the global North.
North,
so
yes, indeed.
The South needs to think together, to make proposals together, but also in conjunction and consultations with our colleagues in the global North, who also live the experiences and the ills that you have indicated. Ashwani, I have many questions, in fact, but we keep abusing of your kindness and generosity, and this is why I will keep it at that. And thank you very much again for this conversation that we've had, and for all that you have contributed and given to us generously at the American University in Cairo, that the project made possible in the last 10 days. Yes, you said 10 days, you're right, it's not 8 days. So thank you very much again, and we keep abusing of your generosity for the rest of today, and we certainly hope to see you again back here at AUC.
Thank you very much. I would say, Ibrahim, that I think that the balance sheet is much more balanced, and there are a lot of benefits which I have received on my side, and you've projected this question in a very creative way from your projects in this, and lots of new thoughts and new challenges have come up, which I shall take back also. So it has also been a learning experience for me, and thank you for that.
Thank you.